So today we're going to explore what I call the second path. And Joseph Campbell talked about the second path as a time of great trials and obstacles. And if we continue with the Jewish metaphor of the coming out of Egypt, this is the time in the wilderness. And the early Christian church, I believe, rightly chose the Gospel of Mark to be the Christian experience of being in a time like unto death, where we walk by the power of the resurrection. So let's look at where we believe Mark was composed. The city of Rome in 64-65 first century. Now in July of 64 is the Great Fire of Rome, where Rome was set on fire and burned for 5 nights and 5 days. The fire was extinguished. A day later it reignited and it burned for another 2 days. At the end of this time, the great heart of the seat of government in Rome had burned, and most of the homes of the aristocracy had burned. Well, the sad synchronicity is that this was precisely the area of Rome that the Emperor Nero wished to tear down and rebuild in an architectural style that he believed would rival Athens. Essentially, Nero had just been before the Roman Senate, saying to them that he thought that the government and homes of the aristocracy were an architectural dump. He was quite surprised that this news was not received well. And then when the fire accomplished exactly what he desired, of course the Roman Senate turned on him, and Nero needed a scapegoat. That scapegoat became the usual scapegoat in the city of Rome, which was the Jewish community, which already twice before in the first century had been expelled. What we don't know is exactly what happened next. We know the effect of it, but somehow Nero was convinced by someone that it was not the entirety of the Jewish community who had set Rome on fire, but rather this small rebel-rousing group of Jews known as the Christus followers, the Christ believers. And that Nero was told that these believers had this figure that they saw as greater than the emperor and who had come to abolish the Roman Empire. Well, that's all Nero needed to have his perfect scapegoat. So what he does now is horrendous, and it actually becomes a model centuries later for Adolf Hitler. He sends his soldiers into the Jewish ghetto, knocking on doors, door by door, and coming to the head of the household. Each head of household had to answer the door, and they had to answer a question. Are you a believer in the Christ, the Christus? If you answer yes, you, your entire family down to your grandchildren will be immediately seized, taken to the Circus Maximus, and summarily executed. If you say no, the horror is not over, because now you must name someone else who is going to be seized, their family's going to be seized, and they're going to be taken to the Circus Maximus, and they're not even going to be given a chance to answer the question. They're going to die on your report. So when that knock on the door comes, someone is going to die. Is it going to be your family, or is it going to be another Jewish family that you know? And if you were to choose the third option, which is to not answer the question, then the soldiers would seize you and your family and take you to the Circus Maximus for death. In the midst of this horror, in the midst of this small Holocaust and genocide, we have the birth of the gospel form, because here in Rome we had the perfect soil of the creation of a new art form. The first art form of this early tradition we call Christianity. We had Peter in Rome giving the historical eyewitness, and we had Paul in Rome teaching us how to change the historical eyewitness to a present moment reality. And we had a moment of tremendous tragedy. And those three elements, as we know, often great power and great beauty comes forth out of moments of tremendous horror. So what happens here in the creation of the Gospel of Mark will be followed by the creation of the other three Gospels. That the Gospel will be built on the historical eyewitness, but not told as historical eyewitness, told as present moment event. And what we have in the text of Mark is the prayer and the song of this community as they are locked in their houses, waiting for that fateful knock on the door. And you can see and you can feel in the way this text is composed and the stories that make part of it, how this supported this early Christian community that's surrounded and about to be exterminated. How it allowed them, by the power of the resurrection, to go to their death with great serenity, great peacefulness. And we know that they did because we actually have a historical record of the Romans going to the Circus Maximus and watching these executions and becoming quite bored because the Christians were not giving them the drama that they had come to see. They were not crying out for their life. That here on the floor of the Circus Maximus, as they died with a noble presence. And I would suggest to you that such nobility cannot be faked. That nobility, the ability in this moment of extremis to face with peacefulness and calm, comes because you know the power of the resurrection already in your heart and in your life. So let's turn now to the text and how this text opens. It opens with the story, which I like to call a meditation. It opens with the meditation on John the Baptist. Now, why would this meditation be so appropriate to these Jewish Christians in Rome about to be executed? Well, as we know in the story, John the Baptist is crying out in a wilderness about the presence of God. And these Jewish Christians in Rome know that they are in a like wilderness. That in fact, they are John the Baptist in this moment. And that they are going to have to proclaim something which is unpopular and that may actually hasten their death. And it goes even further because we know that John the Baptist died, was executed on the whim of a drunken governor. And the Jewish Christians in Rome could certainly identify with this because they were about to die because an emperor needed a scapegoat. So rather than this text, though, being about a moment of horror, the text is about the power of the resurrection. And one of the things that I will talk about it with each one of the four Gospels is the Gospel is the practice of resurrection in the midst of the trauma and the question of a community. So it's not a gospel which just has a story about resurrection at the end. The whole gospel is infused with the grace and the power of the resurrection. That this Gospel of Mark is, how can you walk through the valley of the shadow of death? By the power of Jesus the Christ and the grace of resurrection in your heart. So God is, in this text, not leaving us abandoned, but God is giving us the very power of the resurrection to be with us, to face and move through this moment. And this is the reason that the early church could so rightly, in my view, discern the text of Mark is the text of the second path. That moment, having begun the journey in the first path and having been sent out to wilderness where we will be stripped, where we will have to unlearn, where we will have to accept and make uncertainty welcome in our hearts. That in this place, the presence of God is not in the glory of certitude and home and temple. The presence of God is in the emptiness. The presence of God is in the desert. The presence of God is in our welcoming a fierce inner landscape, perhaps even at times welcoming a fierce outer landscape. Just like this meditation on John the Baptist. The next core piece about Mark is the evangelist has used the topography of Israel and brought it forward to Rome. Now, one of the odd things is that the Circus Maximus, where these early Christians are going to die. Remember that the Colosseum is not built until the end of the first century. So these first martyrdoms are happening at the Circus Maximus, which is an oval-shaped building. Well, the shape of the Circus Maximus has an odd similarity to the Sea of Galilee. And Mark sets Jesus the Christ walking around the Sea of Galilee. But here's the piece that most of us have forgotten about the Sea of Galilee in the first century and to the Jewish heart. The Sea of Galilee was a cemetery and a place of death that was horrific to the Jewish people. They did not think of this as a place to go and sunbathe. This is not water that they wanted to touch. They wanted nothing to do with this tomb, this place where the storms on the Sea of Galilee come up so swiftly that people that go out onto the sea to fish are facing death at every moment. And so what this also informs us is these disciples that Jesus calls to be his first followers are not simpletons. They are courageous heroes to the Jewish people because they already are willing to face death for life. They're willing, for a people who are starving, they are willing to go out on the Sea of Galilee, which is a place of taboo, so that they can bring fish back for their families and their communities. Well, what's so powerful about this is that water in the text of Mark, let's remember there are many associations to water. And we'll get another association when we get to the third path in the Gospel of John. But water in the text of Mark is death. And this line of death, and in the Jewish idiom, water is the place that the demons live. Water is what swept the world away in the flood. Water is what kept them enslaved in Egypt. And the water of the Galilee carries all of those associations. So when Jesus puts the fishermen into the boat at night and orders them, he doesn't invite them, he doesn't suggest, Jesus orders them to get into the boat at night and cross the Sea of Galilee. This is craziness. This is insanity. The fishermen know this. Nobody in their right mind is going to get in a boat and go out on this storm-tossed sea when you can't see the storm coming. And one of the things that the Gospel of Mark teaches us, as the Gospel of Mark taught the early Christians in Rome, is that God wants us to go through certain storms in our life. God is not here to put a Band-Aid and lead us away from the storm, that there are certain moments, and the second path is a profound moment, when God directs us to get into the boat and go into the storm, not alone, but with Him. We as Christians are made for these moments, because it is through these moments that the incarnational faith becomes more than a hope it becomes a deep knowing and a trust. And so therefore, you can hear in this text of the first storm where the disciples are in the boat and Jesus, where is Jesus in this text? Jesus is in the back of the boat. Now, anybody who knows ships and boats in a storm, where do you want to be? You want to be in the back of the boat. You don't want to be in the bow. You don't want to be in the front, because that's the part that takes the brunt of the storm. So Jesus has got the cushy place in the back. And secondly, the evangelist tells us that Jesus is asleep. Well, isn't that nice? We're in a storm and our God's asleep. He's here, but he's asleep. And then the evangelist even amps it up more by saying, well, and Jesus has got his head resting on a pillow. And water is coming in the boat. And our God's in the back asleep comfortably. And Peter cries out, "Wake up, do you not know we're going down? Wake up." Can you hear the Jewish Christians in Rome waiting for that fateful knock on the door? Do something. Get us out of this situation. And Jesus wakes up and calms the outer storm. But the deeper truth in this text is that Jesus calms our inner storm and then gives us the great examination of conscience. Where is your faith? Where is your faith? And that was the examination given to the Jewish Christians in Rome, who almost certainly were looking at their death. And it's the same examination of conscience that's given to us today, with all the cataclysmic events that we are around us and the voice that we hear today very loudly, we're going down. And our God is saying, I am here. Where is your faith? So let's move to the very end of this gospel text. There is so much I would love to share with you, and fortunately it is written, I hope, well in the book. But there is the original end of this gospel, and excuse me, but about 100 years later, there was a second ending added to the gospel, which is not part of the tapestry of this text. The story may be true, but it doesn't fit the text. The original ending of the gospel is Mary and the women come to the tomb and they find the stone rolled back and they go in. And we are told that there is a young man sitting there. Note that in this text we don't even get the story of an angel. It's just a young man dressed in white sitting there. And he says to them, Jesus of Nazareth has gone ahead of you to Galilee. Well, isn't that nice? Because the word Galilee here refers to the Galilean Sea, the place, the tomb, the place of chaos, the place of your deepest anxiety. And at this moment of resurrection, we're told, go to the place of your deepest concerns, the place where you feel most empty, most starved, most thirsty. Go there, and that is where the risen one is waiting for you. And then finally, we hear this instruction to the women to go and tell the disciples. And then comes the stunning last line of the text. Stunning last line of a text written to a people facing their own genocide. It says, and the women fled from the tomb, for fear and amazement had overtaken them, and they said nothing to anyone. End of gospel. The way that I understand this is, this gospel is an examination of conscience. This gospel says, when the knock comes on the door, what's going to be your answer? And it goes even further by saying, essentially, if you only know resurrection as a report by someone else, you're not a follower of the Christ, and there's no need for you to go to the Colosseum and die. Excuse me, the Circus Maximus and die. If you know the resurrection as a living reality in your heart, you know the answer that you must give at that door. And this awesome and perhaps terrifying moment is the original end of the text written to the Jewish Christians in Rome as they waited at table for the Roman centurion to give the knock at the door. And we too, as we travel the second spiritual path, as we find ourselves faced with tremendous anxiety and uncertainties, as we find ourselves perhaps with depressions and even perhaps despair, we're asked ultimately, what will be our answer to this moment? Can we too go more deeply into the difficulties of this moment and experience the resurrection here and now in our hearts? I would like to end with offering you a prayer that comes from our brothers and sisters in the Buddhist tradition, which I think of as a summarization of the second path. And it's a prayer that they often pray as they sit down to begin meditation. And that prayer, that intention is, grant that I may be given the appropriate difficulties and sufferings on this journey, so that my heart may be awakened and my practice of compassion and liberation for all beings may be fulfilled. I'd like to invite Christians today to find this sentiment in our own words through the Gospel of Mark, that this text is not about our crying out for God to change the circumstances, but rather for us to invite the appropriate difficulties and sufferings so that our faith may become deeper.